Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the Working Group 1 meeting. This is for the Extended Day Ahead Market Initiative, and it's related to the supply commitment and resource efficiency evaluation. This is Christina Osborne from the ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group. I'll be providing support for the meeting. Mark Richardson is the facilitator, and Bob Cott is the scribe for this working group. And then Phil Pettengale is the coordinator overseeing all three of the EDAM working groups. We also have George Angelides, who's listed as a panelist. He will be presenting on behalf of the ISO. So Mark Richardson's going to start off. He's going to review the objectives of the meeting, and then he'll turn it over to George to present detailed examples on the resource qualification and RSC counting. And then Mark is planning to circle back on the DR accounting topic that we discussed at the last meeting. And then we have reserved some time at the end of the presentation to provide a recap of the discussion and then review the topics for the next meeting. Again, these are just some reminders. If at any time you have a question or want to share your perspective, please raise your hand and the facilitator will call on you when it's your turn in the queue. And just a reminder to please introduce yourself first. We are recording the meeting and we will post the video file as soon as we receive it from the vendor. So usually it takes about 2 to 3 business days before we receive that. It will be posted out on the working group webpage along with the other materials that are related to this working group. And then again, if you are interested in presenting at an upcoming working group meeting at any of them, please, there's an inquiry link on the resources slide at the very end of this presentation. You can go ahead and submit a request and the ISO will reach out to you and coordinate the details for that meeting. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to Mark.
Thank you, Christina. Can you confirm you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon, team. I appreciate everyone taking the time today to continue our efforts in the space. As Christina mentioned, today's discussion will be a follow-up action item from last Friday. As a group, we covered a few hypothetical examples for hydro and battery resource types where I believe we started to conceptualize the need for a planned advisory operation schedule to be provided by the EDAM entity along with the bids that would help inform the RSC of the resources planned operations for the day. With that being said, I believe George Angelides from the ISO has put together a spreadsheet that illustrates a comprehensive example of evaluating the RSC based on those bids provided. After talking through this spreadsheet, we will then transition into some of those examples specifically for energy limited resources and what that participation may look like. I really am looking for stakeholders' thoughts and opinions on this approach, so please feel supported in speaking up. If time permits, we will jump back into some of the demand response discussion we had this past Monday. George, feel free to take it from here. I'll pause you naturally throughout your presentation for questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. This is George Angelides from the ISO. I want to start here with a spreadsheet example that I made up to explain how the resource efficiency evaluation that we presented last time in this work group can play out with some numbers. Yeah, I know Mark said it's a comprehensive example, but you know, I really made something simple up just to illustrate how the concepts are going to work with numbers, and we can walk through that. So, in a very simple manner, I have 2 BAAs here, BAA 1 and BAA 2, and it's a 4-hour horizon. All right. So, to simplify, also, I group all the supply into an aggregate supply for each BAA. So I assumed here that the supply has capacity from 500 to 4,000 and that all of that capacity is bid in the market. So you have an energy bid from 500 to 4,000. And this is the supply ramp rate, the aggregate ramp rate over an hour, since we're talking about hourly schedules here. So this BAA1 has a 1,200 megawatt ramp capability for each hour. I assumed a certain demand forecast for this BAA. And then
hey, George,
I have, yes.
I'm sorry. Do you mind zooming in a little bit?
I'm sorry.
That it's a little hard to see. And then just a reminder, in WebEx, for the stakeholders on the call, you do have the capability to Zoom. That's much better, George. Thank you.
Yeah, and forgive me, I forgot about that. Picking up where I was left off, I also added the bucket one transfers here to show how this is going to work with the resource efficiency evaluation. And I have an energy transfer of 100 megawatts from BAA1 to BAA2. You can see that in BAA2 it's negative, so it's received. So I'm using the net schedule interchange convention that positive transfer is an export, negative transfer is an import. And I put one for the imbalance reserve up product. So for these hours 3 and 4, there's also a 50 megawatt imbalance reserve up transferred from BAA1 to BAA2. So we'll see how this plays out here in the RSC. The focus in this example is the upward capacity and ramp capability test. The downward is a mirror image of the upward direction, so I didn't include it in the example to keep it simple. And then this has equations too coded in here that tell you whether you pass or fail the test. So if you change the numbers in blue, you'll see how the participation of the supply can affect your the outcome of the test. So for the upward capacity test, essentially what we're trying to do, it's in a simple way, we try to see the upper economic limit, which here we assume it's the total capacities in the market. So if this 4,000 megawatt is sufficient to meet our target for that hour 2 in this highlighted column here, which is the demand forecast plus the upward uncertainty requirement, which I assume it's 100 megawatts, plus the transfer one, the bucket one transfer for 100 megawatts of energy to BA2. So as you can see, BA1, because of this, it assumes an additional 100 megawatt obligation in their demand forecast. Essentially, it bumps up their demand forecast from 1,500 to 1,600 because there's a transfer of demand forecast for the RSC purposes from BA2 to BA1. All right. And if this equation is met, basically you have enough capacity, you pass the test. The same here. And here we also have the transfer for imbalance reserve up adds up to the requirement. So that's another transfer of requirement. This uncertainty requirement is transferred between BA2 and BA1, which is declared with this 50 megawatt bucket one transfer. It's a similar equation. So you're trying to see if the 4,000 megawatt of available capacity in the market can meet 2,000 megawatt of demand plus 100 megawatt of upward uncertainty plus 100 megawatt of energy transfer under the bucket one to BA2 plus 50 megawatt of imbalance reserve up transfer from BA1 to BA2. So this is the capacity test. It's very simple and straightforward. I didn't add all these other elements that I had in my presentation where we make sure that there's enough ancillary services bids to meet your ancillary service requirements. And we wanted to show the more complicated aspect where you perform the capacity test over all the products together to meet your targets. For the ramp capability, it's a simple matter of basically considering your total hourly ramp capability, right? And let me start from here because we're as you can see, the demand forecast is increasing here over consecutive hours. So we have a cumulative flexible ramp up test that checks to make sure that from the beginning of the day, you can actually hit all the cumulative targets throughout this upward ramp here for the demand forecast. So for this hour, for hour 2, you have a 1,200 megawatt ramp capability from the previous hour. Okay, and we limit that to your capacity as it will become more relevant as we move towards hour 4. So for this hour, it's not relevant because we're still below the 4,000, right? So we assume that everything is ramping up from 500. That's your lower economic limit. So you have 500 plus 1,200 for the ramp up capability, limited by the 4,000 limit, which doesn't apply in this particular hour because we're early in the day, right? And then we want to make sure that this can meet your target, which again, the target is your demand forecast plus the upward uncertainty plus the adjustments for any bucket one transfers. In this hour, we only have the energy transfer, so that adds in. So you're looking for a target of 1,500 plus 100 plus 100. And as you can see in this hour, the ramp capability is sufficient. And as we progress, you'll see that at the end of the day, it's a cumulative requirement. So now you add up the cumulative ramp capability all the way from here. All right, so it's that 1,200 megawatt is coming 3 times here to meet the target in the 4th hour. And then your target in the 4th hour is your demand forecast, again, plus the upward uncertainty for that hour, plus the energy transfer and the imbalance reserve up transfer that adds up in this hour. And if you want to see what happens if you don't have the available capability, in this example, these numbers say that you pass the test, both the capacity test and the ramp capability test. Let's go here and say that this bucket one transfer does not happen in this hour. And of course, BAA1 is okay, but BAA2, where the transfer was going to, it needs that transfer to pass the test. And in this case, both the capacity test and the flexible ramp test fail because you don't have enough capacity and flexibility to hit the target for the 4th hour. If I restore this, put the transfer back up, as you can see now, BAA2 can pass the test. And this illustrates the impact that these bucket one transfers can have in EDAM, which was our objective, and the objective of having the concept of the bucket one transfer, which essentially shows to the market that there is a bilateral contract in place between the BAAs that one BAA can assist another BAA in passing the test. And this can happen with an energy transfer and or with capacity transfers. And in this case, I use the imbalance reserve, which is the most common outcome that we can expect in EDAM. So we will release the spreadsheet. It's for educational purposes, and so that we can have something tangible in what we propose and what we saw it in graphs. This has numbers, so you can also play around with it to see how the numbers change the outcome. It's live, and we hope that this is a useful tool to provide some understanding in the methodology that we described earlier at the theoretical level. Let me just stop here and see if there are any specific questions on this, and then we'll move to other examples, as Mark said.
Thank you, George. And just to confirm, the supply minimum and supply maximum, that is essentially the aggregate of the bids, correct? And potentially this new advisory operation profile for energy limited resources?
I'm going to go into that next. So here we assume that these resources that are aggregated to what we call here the aggregate supply in each BAA, they're not fuel limited resources, so we can actually use their bids for the resource efficiency evaluation. Next, we're going to start discussing in examples of how we do it differently for fuel limited resources, and that will introduce the concept of the advisory operating schedule. So here we're at a very fundamental level. Assume that all the supply doesn't have this kind of limitation, so we use strictly their bids and their participation in the market to perform the test. And also the additional assumption here for the simplicity of this example is that the entire capacity that the resource has is bid into the market. So there's no differentiation between what we call supply maximum capacity and the upper economic limit. In reality, there could be a difference between those two, and the formulas that I included in the previous presentation illustrate how this difference affects the outcome.
Okay, thank you, George. And then one more question, and then I'll turn it over to Michelle. So does the ISO foresee, so here you show the energy transfer, which I believe I heard you say would be a bilateral agreement between BAA2 and BAA1. Is there a confirmation? So let's say BAA2 submits this transfer or indicates this transfer. Is there a confirmation by BAA1 in order for this to be seen as valid?
Yes, that's a good question, Mark. And we can follow the approach that we use in EIM, where when we have a transfer registered between two BAAs, there is a common agreement between the BAAs, between the EAM entities, that the transmission is released for that transfer, and we register it in the master file, and then we have one of the two BAAs, one of the two entities, being responsible for submitting the scheduling limit on the transfer. So we mark that as an attribute of the transfer in the master file so that our system, specifically cyber in this case, knows that this transfer is I said cyber, I meant the market, the real-time market receives a scheduling limit from that EIM entity dynamically in real time because it can change. And then we enforce that scheduling limit. So we get it from one side, and the understanding is that we also make it visible to the other side. And the understanding is that this is some coordination in place with the two entities with regard to the transfer that takes place between them. So we can follow similar principles here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that clarification, George. Let me go to Michelle Quito at the CPUC. If you wouldn't mind, oh, there we go. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hey, George, this is Michelle Quito from the CPUC. I just want to confirm, when you put energy transfer in here, what you're saying is that this is between two EDAM BAAs, right? And so
correct.
So what you,
yes.
So we're not yet dealing with the idea of intertie bidding and whether and how those count to meet anyone's resource efficiency. Is that right?
Not yet, yes. This is an upcoming item that we'll definitely discuss in detail after we go through the hump of figuring out first and agreeing, sort of, what's happening between EDAM BAAs. Then we'll start looking outside of EDAM and see what happens with imports and exports from and to entities outside the market footprint, yes.
Okay, and then I have another question. I know that there was some discussion of on-demand resource efficiency tests, but given that bids only have to be submitted day of at 10 a.m., how those on-demand resource efficiency tests won't be useful to the extent that there aren't bids there, is that right?
The idea is that bids are submitted ahead of the market close time, and in fact, we can receive day-ahead bids 7 days in advance. So there will be bids that are submitted by scheduling coordinators for the resources, and similar to EIM, at a different time scale, of course, we make the range, the megawatt range of these bids available to the EIM entity so that they have situational awareness regarding the ability for the BAA to pass the test. So to the extent that this information has been submitted to the market operator and we make it available to a BAA, an entity, an EDAM entity in this case, it will be possible for the EDAM entity to use a tool in the market interface that we're considering making it available for this on-demand resource efficiency evaluation test that will take all the information that's available by that time, meaning the bid ranges that have been submitted for all the resources in that BAA, plus any bucket one transfers that have been declared, and then perform these calculations in a simplistic manner as shown here. It's a little bit more elaborate, of course, but then we'll be able to see whether they pass or fail the capacity test for any hour in the trading day.
And then in terms of timing, if the market stays the same and bids are due 10 a.m. day of, are you imagining that you would do the final resource sufficiency test after that, say 11 o'clock, or are you imagining that you would simultaneously do the resource sufficiency and the market run?
It's sequential, but it happens at the market close time. So when we close the market at 10, which means this is the deadline for submitting bids, then at that point we have everything what we need to perform the resource sufficiency evaluation test for one final time, and then run the market. So after 10 o'clock, this resource sufficiency evaluation test, as we have said before, it's a screen, it's supposed to be fast, no optimization, and some rudimentary algebraic calculations. Essentially, it shouldn't take more than a few seconds. We have the results. We know then, based on the policy that we'll establish here in this work group, what happens if you pass, and we know what happens if you pass the test. You're part of the optimization in EDAM. We have to discuss what happens if you fail. Well, this failure consequence will be reflected in the market solution that comes next.
Okay, but just to be clear, there's no opportunity to clear after the market closes at 10 a.m., is that right?
Let's say there's no opportunity to revise any bids or transfer declarations after 10 o'clock when we close the market. And specifically for transfers, we're thinking of moving it up to 9 a.m. because we want to freeze the transmission from 9 to 10, as is the case today. In our day-ahead market, we freeze outages and transmission at 9. And because we want to give a meaningful time to EDAM entities to cure any failures in the advisory RSC that will be performed and published at 9 a.m., we're thinking a little bit more than just freezing the outages and the available transmission capacity that is released in transfers. We're thinking of even freezing the demand forecast or even the uncertainty requirements. So basically all the input that goes into this RSC calculation, because otherwise it will be a moving target. So if we freeze everything at 9 and you have the results of an advisory RSC at 9, then you know what's going on. You know how much short you are, and then you know what you're looking for. If you're looking at additional capacity or additional ramp capability, you have 1 hour to coordinate some activities for which, we'll let EDAM B8 develop their own process to come up with this perhaps additional bids or additional participation in the market and have the appropriate scheduling coordinators revise their bids or submit new bids by 10 a.m. that we close the market.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Michelle. All right, let's go to Tong Wu at WAPA.
George, I see uncertainty up and imbalance reserve up. Are they covering the same uncertainty after the day ahead, between the day ahead and real time, or they're covering different kind of uncertainties? Is there kind of a two product covering the same uncertainty?
Okay, let's break this down a little bit, Tong. So imbalance reserve is what we call the product that we're going to use to address uncertainty. And we calculate the uncertainty requirements in EDAM. The idea is to use what we have proposed for the day-ahead market enhancements. Essentially, we calculate the uncertainty at a high percentile of the uncertainty that could potentially materialize between the day-ahead market and the 15-minute market in real time, which is basically having contributions from multiple things like historical contributions from demand forecast error, solar forecast error, wind forecast error, and then also an input from the forecast that we know in the day-ahead time frame for demand solar and wind for the next day. So there is a regression of all this input data to produce a high percentile for the uncertainty that may materialize in FMM. And we procure that as we set an imbalanced reserve requirement for that uncertainty, and we procure it in the day-ahead market, co-optimizing with energy.
George, maybe I didn't get it.
Okay.
Yeah, let me ask you again. If you have the imbalance reserve to cover uncertainty, why do you need the upward uncertainty separately considered here again? Are you saying they're covering different kinds of uncertainty?
What do you say it's separate? This is the demand forecast is here, okay?
Yeah.
And this is the upward uncertainty requirement.
Yes.
So they're not different. So the demand forecast is, you can say, your 50 percentile of all the uncertainty. It doesn't include, it's your 50 percentile demand forecast, and then this is the level of uncertainty at the 97.5 percentile that we expect to potentially see between day ahead and 15-minute market. Two different quantities. You see something duplicated?
Yeah. So then imbalance, you're saying that my load might be higher, might be 100 megawatt higher, or maybe this 100 megawatt includes load forecast error, also renewable forecasting error, could be other things.
All of them.
But altogether, you got this 100 megawatt uncertainty.
Yes.
Then you just have to have imbalance reserve to cover that.
Yes.
Now you're adding these two up, right?
Okay, so the procurement of 100 megawatt of imbalance reserves to cover that 100 megawatt requirement, that's done in the market, all right? So here in the resource efficiency evaluation, we haven't run the market yet. All we're saying is that do we have enough capacity and flexibility to cover for a specific hour the combination of the demand forecast and the upward uncertainty requirement. We haven't procured imbalance reserve yet. So all we're saying is that do we have the bids that we can? It's a hypothetical question.
I think it's the transfer, imbalance reserve up transfer, that might be confusing him.
This is just a transfer of requirement.
Yeah, transfer is fine. I was thinking that if you have uncertainty 100 megawatt, you just need to cover 100 megawatt. But here you require to provide 100 megawatt for the upward uncertainty and then additional 50 megawatt. So you're using 150 megawatt of capacity to cover 100 megawatt of equivalent uncertainty.
Okay, then I think Michelle is right. Let's break it down, Tom. So let's go to this hour that there is this transfer as well. Okay, so what we're saying here is that the demand forecast is 3,000 megawatts. Okay, and we calculate an upward uncertainty of 100 megawatts. Okay, so your target becomes 3,100. You need to have enough capacity and flexibility to hit that 3,100 mark because 3,000 is our forecast, but it may be 3,100 materialized in FMM, right? So we need to hit 3,100. Now, what these numbers are, this is the transfer of additional responsibility from BAA2 to BAA1 through the mechanism of the bucket 1 transfer, which essentially is a contract between, or it stipulates that there is a contract between BAA1 and BAA2, and BAA1 essentially assists BAA2 in passing their test by saying, I will reserve transmission capacity, and that's the bucket 1 transfer, for 100 megawatts so that I can provide 100 megawatts of energy if you need it to meet your demand and uncertainty. And in this hour, there is also another 50 megawatts of transmission capacity earmarked for imbalance reserve. So I'm going to procure 50 megawatts of additional imbalance reserve. I only need 100, but I'm going to procure 150. That 50, you can use it to pass your resource efficiency evaluation test, and the transmission capacity, it will be there for the market to optimize for later in the market if it ends up coming from me or from somewhere else. That's economic displacement. But for the purpose of the test, This says that this BA1 assumes an additional responsibility of 100 megawatts for the demand forecast, coming reducing BA's2 demand forecast for the test, and an additional responsibility of 50 megawatt upward uncertainty, which reduces by 50 megawatts the upward uncertainty for BA2. So essentially, BA1 assumes 150 megawatt responsibility of additional RSC requirement on behalf of BAA2. That's what this transfer here is doing.
I wasn't talking about the transfer to somebody else, just thinking that you have demand of 3,000.
You mentioned 50. I know you mentioned 50, and this is the only 50 number that I have. So
but why do I need
again.
the 50? My question is, why do I need the 50? I already covered uncertainty 100. I use 4,000 megawatt of capacity to cover 3,000 megawatt of load and 100 megawatt of upward uncertainty and additional 100 megawatt of a transfer to somebody else. Then I'm done. Why do I need to cover additional 50? Should the 50 be considered in the upward uncertainty already?
Because this additional 50 is not an uncertainty requirement for that BAA. It's a uncertainty requirement that is transferred from BAA2. So essentially, BAA1 assists BA2 in meeting their resource sufficiency evaluation when it comes to uncertainty requirement. It says that you have 100 megawatt of uncertainty requirement. I can take 50 of that and I can procure it potentially in my BAA, so you don't have to cover that in your resource sufficiency evaluation. I will take it on as my responsibility. That's what this does. So yes, it's additional. They don't need it. They don't need it. They actually offer it as a service, which could be compensated under a contract. Doesn't matter. For the resource sufficiency evaluation, once it's declared, we'll use it. We'll understand that this is a transfer of uncertainty requirement from BA2 to BA1, so we'll use it in the RSC in that way.
So George, if I'm following you correctly, the energy transfer and imbalance reserve up transfer are additive, not cumulative.
For the purpose of the capacity test and the cumulative flex ramp capability test, yes, they add up because you have to meet the combined target. There are additional elements of the capacity test that I don't show in this example, which is you have to have sufficient imbalance reserve bids to cover your imbalance reserve requirements. So now, since you, as a BA1, assumes an additional responsibility for 50 megawatts of imbalance reserve requirements, and 100 was the original, we want to see a total of 150 megawatts of imbalance reserve up bids. So it's handled in another test, and I don't show it here for simplicity, but there is also this notion that it's a different product than energy, so it has to be covered with bids for that product as well. So that's another aspect of the capacity test.
Oh, I see. So the 50 is a part of that 100. You're just not showing explicitly here.
Additional to 100. So this is 100 is what is the native requirement for BA1, and 50 is an assumed responsibility for another BA. It's additive to the 100, so now you have to cover 150 in total, okay?
Right. So here the 50 is you're covering somebody else in balance reserve. Yes. Now for BAA1 itself, does it have any imbalance reserve up requirement?
Yes.
If they don't transfer, regardless of whether they transfer or not, itself would have this requirement. Otherwise, why would BA2 wants that, right?
Yeah, so 100 is the native requirement, right? So if the transfer was not in place, if I make it, if I make it, 0 here, BA1 is not affected, still passing the test. BA2 that fails now because it doesn't get that transfer. So this is what the transfer does. BA1 has surplus capacity, if you will, that is in the market, so it can help another BA that is short in capacity to pass the test by reserving or declaring transmission capacity between the two, all right, that could be used by the market for that purpose economically at that point. So in the test, we're just saying, all right, there is such capacity available, so we can transfer the requirement and perform the test with the adjusted requirement.
So George, maybe I'll just wait for another example. Maybe later you have another example that shows the imbalance reserve requirement for BAA itself, not for somebody else. In that example, maybe we will see
For
how
that 100.
what's the relationship between upward uncertainty and imbalance reserve.
Yeah, I see
That's
Danny Johnson from the ISO. Did you want to also weigh in, maybe try to help clarify Tong?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. I think, Tong, what George is saying is that the upward uncertainty or the IRU requirement native to BAA1 would be covered in row 6. Row 6 is the IRU requirement native to BAA1. Row 7 would be an energy transfer that is reflected between BAA1 and 2. And then row 8 would be a imbalance reserve transfer, which would be a separate product in the day-ahead time frame between BAAs 1 and 2. Does that help?
Okay, I'm gonna stop asking questions. I think probably I'm taking too much time.
That's okay, but Tom, you're familiar with the ancillary service transfer, ancillary service obligation transfer mechanism that the ISO has in its market today, right?
Yeah.
From the older days, which is essentially, it's a declared bilateral between scheduling coordinators where one scheduling coordinator assumes some responsibility of the ancillary service obligation of another scheduling coordinator.
Yes.
And the way we handle it and it's not in the market, it's in the ancillary service cost allocation settlements, essentially that transfer of ancillary service obligation transfers obligation from one scheduling coordinator to another. And this is a similar concept where these bucket one transfers, they transfer now responsibility for meeting your RSC target from one BAA to another. It's a similar concept, if I may draw a parallel.
Okay. Is there an imbalance reserve up requirement for BAA1 itself? Is that included in the upward uncertainty megawatt 100 already?
No, this is the 100 we're talking about. That's the upward uncertainty requirement for BAA1 alone.
Yeah.
This is what BAA1 is willing to take additional responsibility that's coming off of BA's 200 megawatt upward requirement. So when this transfer comes in place, BA1 requirement now is to meet 150 megawatt of uncertainty, and BA2 meet only 50, because 50 megawatts is transferred to BA1. That's what this transfer does.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I'm sure in future calls in this session, we'll start diving into uncertainty, what exactly that looks like, how it's derived, and things like that, Tong. So maybe some of those questions you may have may get answered through there. I did see Steve Kern's hand come up, and I just want to make sure Steve didn't have a comment or question. Steve, if you did, I do not see your hand up anymore, but I wanted to give you an opportunity. All right, he just confirmed no questions. I see Steve Greenleaf. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm just trying to track this dialogue here, and I want to make sure I understand it. But George, is it as simple as the upward uncertainty is the requirement, and the imbalance reserve is the product used to address that requirement?
Yes, but this line here is not the imbalance reserve up product, is the transfer.
I know, but it's effectively transferring the upward uncertainty requirement for BAA2 to BAA1. I'm just wondering if it's a labeling issue.
Only for the purpose of the resource efficiency evaluation, not in the market.
Yes, no, understand that.
Yeah.
Understand that, but it's effectively, I'm just wondering if you just labeled it, this line 8 as upward uncertainty requirement for BAA2, which BAA1 is assuming. So I think maybe that's where the confusion is, because you're talking upward uncertainty requirement, but at least on a BA level, they're going to be addressing that requirement by ensuring they have sufficient imbalance reserve bids. So anyway, I thought I would.
Yeah, no,
I just want to make sure I was tracking.
That's a good comment here, because I'm showing it algebraically, and you can see from the equation that this is minus that. It's essentially whatever you say you're going to transfer is reflected as the opposite transfer in the other direction. So it's a bilateral.
Yeah.
So
no, I completely get it. In fact, I was going to say what you did. It's exactly the same as the transfer of the AAS obligations that we have today, the inter-SE trade of SE obligation or AAS obligation. So I get it. To me, it was just a labeling issue.
Steve, do you mind stating who you represent?
Oh, I'm sorry. Brookfield Renewable, Steve Greenleaf.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Thank you,
All
Steve.
right.
Yep.
Yeah, good suggestion there, Steve. And then I also saw Carrie Bentley's hand come up and then come back down. Carrie, did you have a question and maybe just having issues with the raise hand icon? I will take silence and no chat as you are good. And then I see, Jenny, you received your response to your question, so thank you on that. All right, George, maybe if you have anything else you'd like to cover here, maybe now's a good time to transition to the other presentation.
Mark, hold on one second. I think we're having some audio issues. The event producer reached out and said that she lost audio connection, so I just want to make sure people can hear us.
Maybe in the chat, if someone can confirm they hear me, I would appreciate it. I did get confirmation that
I can hear you. And this is Steve. I'm still on, and I can hear you guys fine, but I don't know if that matters.
Okay.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, looks like everyone's saying they can hear us, and looks like Kathleen did have audio issues, and she is now back on. So thank you, everyone, for your patience on that. Go ahead, George.
All right, so I'll stop sharing this one. Let me share the presentation. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so this is a short slide deck. I wanted to, based on what we discussed last time, include some examples about how different the accounting could be for resources that we cannot simply take their bids and use them in the resource efficiency evaluation, because there are other considerations that limit their participation. And we talked about the energy limitation of hydro resources, the state of charge limitation of batteries. I wanted to generalize a little bit and basically say that there is potentially a limitation for fuel. Fuel limited resources, their fuel limitation can translate to an energy limitation. So because that energy limitation limits participation, simply accounting their contributions to capacity and flexibility with their bids is not sufficient. It's not going to have a correct representation of their actual capability. So the idea that we were working on the last time was that because there are these energy limitations, we want to have some mechanism to use instead of the bids. And that mechanism, I'm referring to it here, I'm calling it hourly advisory operating schedule. Advisory because it's not going to be used in the market. And it's in no way going to represent how the optimal schedule will be calculated by the market economically using the bids. So in the market, we use the bids for finding the optimal schedule. In the resource efficiency evaluation, because we cannot use the bids because there is this energy limitation that limits the contribution of the resource to the RSC, we want to use a different mechanism, and that is the hourly advisory operating schedule, which is essentially submitted by the scheduling coordinator for these resources that are attributed or marked in the master file that are fuel limited, to be general. And it's basically an hourly profile of a feasible potential schedule that the scheduling coordinator could use to plan the operation of the resource for the next trading day, without the commitment to have this schedule carry on to day-ahead schedules, because as I said, that's the responsibility of the day-ahead market using the bids to produce that schedule, and those energy limitations are already constraints that the market models in the solution, so we make sure that the market is going to produce a feasible schedule. So logistically, this will be similar to how base schedule coordinators, or I'm not exactly from the term there, in EIM submit base schedules for non-participating resources, but the comparison ends there. So here we're talking about participating resources that they have bids in the market, and along with their bid, okay, they can submit this hourly advisory operating schedule, similar to a base schedule, but it's not going to be used as a base schedule. Okay, it's just an indication of a feasible schedule that provides a profile during the day to be used for resource efficiency evaluation. So this will be potentially a new day-ahead bid component in using our cyber language. So along with your bid, you have a special bid component that will make up for the submission of this advisory schedule. The deadline for this, we want it to be again in 9 a.m. because we want to freeze everything after 9 a.m. whatever input is used in the resource efficiency evaluation, so that we don't have a moving target. The bids, of course, can continue to be revised until we close the market for bids, which is 10 a.m. So we have this different deadline for the hourly advisory operating schedule. We want to be final by 9 a.m. And of course, we have to make sure that it's a feasible schedule, so there will be some validation that cyber can perform, make sure that the schedule is feasible. What we're going to look into that, basically, it must be within the energy bid range so that the market can potentially achieve it. That's what we mean feasible. Is this schedule something that the market could potentially end with? So it has to be within the energy bid range, because that's only what the market can schedule. That's a very simple validation. The other one's a little bit more involved, and I put it in general terms here. That schedule should not violate intertemporal constraints from an initial condition. And this could be different things. If it is a general fuel limited resource that they have intertemporal constraints like startup times, minimum up-down times, that could be relevant. Even ramp rate could be relevant. You should submit an hourly operating schedule that is feasible with respect to the ramp capability that the resource has. Ramp rate, obviously, for hydro resources on a 60-minute period, and definitely for batteries, is not really relevant, but I'm just listing it here, trying to have a general case for every resource that could have such a relevant limitation that limits its contribution to the RSE. And of course, very relevant for hydro resources, as we discussed before, is the daily energy limit that reflects an allotment of hydro volume that can be discharged during the day, or for batteries, the state of charge limits that the resource, the device, has limited state of charge capability. So we have to make sure that as the operating schedule is submitted, we'll validate to make sure that the state of charge in the device can actually is consistent with the schedule, in the sense that the schedule is feasible from a state of charge point of view. And when this, if this is validated and we know that this schedule is a potential feasible schedule, then we'll use it in the RSE instead of the bids to calculate the contribution that this specific resource has to the capacity test and to the flexibility test. And we only use it in RSE. After that, it's irrelevant anymore. In the day-ahead market, we're just using the bids to produce optimal day-ahead schedules and ancillary services and imbalanced reserve awards. So these are the general principles of this approach, and I will move into show some very simple examples here.
So, George, before you move on, I do have a hand up. So it looks like Danny Johnson from the ISO has a comment or question.
Oh, sure.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce something that George was saying. To the extent that the advisory operating plans are something that we move forward with for the design of this, those would only be used in the RSE. We do not envision settling those operating plans against the results of the day-ahead market and the optimal schedules it produces. So he kind of beat me to the punch a little bit, but I thought that was worth repeating. Thanks, Mark.
Oh, that's good.
All right, Alva. Thank you, Danny. Operator, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Alva's line.
I almost thought you had caught me, Mark. Well, I'm somewhat jumping into the examples already, but I just wanted to suggest that there might be one step of further sophistication to be introduced here, which is not as much as running a simulated market, but which addresses one of the core issues here, which is a proposed schedule that a market participant submits is generally done in ignorance of what the net load forecast or the load forecast is going to be of the BAA or the system as a whole. And really what you'd be looking for is a feasible schedule such that the highest production could be used in the hour of highest need, and so forth. In other words, there might be another feasible schedule based on the feasible schedule that's being submitted, essentially the same quantities that could better satisfy a resource sufficiency need, and that would still be a feasible schedule based on the way you're describing it. And I just think you might want to consider one step further from this particular approach, which is very dependent on the schedule knowing something about the need. Unless you're going to propose that the need is actually something that's actually published prior to the schedule being produced, which is another alternative that would be reasonable, but in the time frame of what we're talking about, I think it's actually simpler potentially for you to do a very simple test where you would essentially shuffle the schedule in order to get essentially its maximum use for the resource sufficiency test. So just an idea to raise with you, George. Thank you.
Thank you, Alva. And yes, I did make the assumption that these operating schedules are submitted not in ignorance of the needs. And as I'm going to show in examples next, I draw these examples with the backdrop of the net demand forecast, which we can publish as a market operator as a guidance. So the understanding is that you know where the need of the system is, both for capacity and for ramp, because we know the demand forecast and we know the VER forecast, so we can calculate the net demand forecast that the market's going to use. And as we said earlier, we'll think of freezing those at 9 a.m. so that we freeze the target for the resource sufficiency evaluation. So these examples, and this one is for hydro, and I make some assumption for the net demand forecast, the familiar belly of the duck here. So as you said, as a scheduling coordinator planning your hydro resource operation, obviously you want to use your limited amount of water discharge to produce energy when it matters most, because you also expect to have, as a participant, more revenue during these times, because greater need, higher price, normally. So based on this net demand forecast, one hydro operating resource here, and this is just an example, right? I just made up the numbers. So this is by light blue here, or cyan. I saw the hydro operating schedule, these bars, and this plant here strives to cover capacity where it's needed, and also ramp where it's needed during the up and downward ramps. This resource actually has contributions both to the capacity test and to the ramp capability test. So you have a daily energy limit of 620 megawatt hours, and this advisory operating schedule across the day, this profile here, basically gives one possible way of how this 620 megawatt hours could be distributed in a beneficial way in the market. And we'll take this and we'll use it in the capacity and flexible resource sufficiency evaluation. We'll publish the results. So the scheduling coordinators will have an idea about what the need of the system is. We'll publish this net demand forecast. It's not a problem. And what they don't know, of course, is what other scheduling coordinators will do. And that's where the EDAM entity comes into the picture. And when the results are passing, of course, there's nothing to do, everything. It's a happy outcome. If there is a failure of the result in an hour, we'll also publish as part of the test specifics about how much of the failure, like maybe you're missing X megawatts of capacity or Y megawatts of ramp capability for that hour. So then that will provide useful information, we think, for the EDAM entity to identify the particular need that exists in the BAA, and with some coordination mechanisms that they will have to develop with their load-serving entities, participants, scheduling coordinators in their BAA, we expect that between 9 and 10, they will be able to cure that problem by shifting perhaps more capacity bids, more flexible resources to participate in those hours that they need most, in these hours that they fail the test. So that's the general idea. I hope that this provides some answer to your question, Alva. So,
yeah, hold on, George. We have a few more. I appreciate you laying that out. And
okay.
I was able to follow that. So I saw Steve Greenleaf's hand, and then it looks like it went down. So if you do have a question, Steve, feel free to raise your hand again. But for now, let's go to Kathleen Colbert.
Yes.
Hi, great. Thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you go back to the last slide, please?
The one before this?
Yes.
Oh, okay. This one, right?
Yeah, I think this is good. This is helpful. So I just want to, we talked about this, I think, towards the end of the last meeting, clarified that, we're not trying to solve an RA problem. We're trying to solve a resource efficiency test question here. With that in light, I think a lot of what we talked about last week about needing some kind of shaping of a profile and coming up with like RA equivalent counting rules is not something that we need anymore. But I also wanted to clarify a couple things here as a scheduling coordinator. I'm going to use a storage asset. I don't believe that we can provide an hourly advisory operating schedule the way that you're envisioning, because it's pretty inconsistent with the way that we think about our bids and how the market is optimizing those bids based on its needs. It's kind of consistent, I think, with what Alva's flagging. I just wanted to flag that challenge and how this would be giving a new request and asking for scheduling coordinators to come up with counterfactual operating schedules that we don't really do today. We submit bids based on our capability and our must offers, and the market uses them based on economics and its needs. So I wanted to raise that sensitivity. I think we're going to need to think about how to do what you're proposing in concept and in spirit in a way that is more consistent with how scheduling coordinators bid today, so we can use the bids and take into consideration the use limits you're raising, George. And I'll take that back and work on that more and work with the CAISO offline too. And potentially we can talk about some alternates next week. But I just wanted to raise those concerns.
No, thank you, Kathleen. And maybe I'll turn to the audience here before you respond, George, to see if others share that same concern. I would like to gauge the audience there to see if that's something that they're also concerned about from a feasibility standpoint. Let's go to, I've seen Steve Kearns in the queue for a while. It'd be great, Steve, if you can answer that question first and then go from there.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, one of the points I wanted to make is I am a bit concerned about a 9 a.m. deadline for Northwest Hydro submitting a feasible operating schedule. That would basically rely on at least 1 day old streamflow forecasts, which would give you a not very accurate picture of what the hydro resource plan might be that early in the day. So yeah, I do share some of Kathleen's concerns, but from a different perspective, I think.
So when you say 9 a.m., Steve, are you saying to the extent that profile is able to get updated by bid submission deadline, would that meet that need?
I'm not a fan of 10 a.m. either.
Okay, but it gets you closer to a more feasible, realistic schedule?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Steve, I sympathize with the part that you don't know exactly how the hydro conditions will be for the next day, but we're trying to run the market for the next day.
Sure.
What information we have available, so I don't know how else to do it.
That's totally fair, but forecasting stream flows in the Pacific Northwest is complex business, and it takes several hours in the morning every day, I think, for hydro operators in the Northwest to have a good handle on what the next day's fuel supply is going to be, which is a huge deal in the springtime, especially. But if you don't mind, if you go to the next slide, I want to walk through a thought experiment here with you. So if you can imagine a market participant whose only resource is a set of hydro resources, and try to envision what this picture would look like, right? So presumably the hydro operating schedule would be, much closer, or it'll equal or exceed the net demand, presumably, right? If that was the only resource. So what my question then is that if this market participant only has hydro, and the only measure that you're showing here for hydro resources is the ability to meet net demand, is there a need to do other tests that consider upward uncertainty as well as contingency reserves? Or is the intent to only measure against net demand for hydro?
That's not the intent. We did say earlier that you have to actually show the ability to meet not only the demand forecast, but also uncertainty, and that you have sufficient bids in the market or self-provision, since we're not going to optimize for ancillary services, to meet your ancillary service requirements. So there are a few more parts to this. And I'm using here the net demand forecast only as a guidance to basically address Alva's question, like what is the input that I can use to come up with a reasonable, operating schedule for my hydro resources. In reality, in the resource efficiency evaluation, as I mentioned last time, we're not going to use the net demand forecast. We're going to use the demand forecast itself because we consider VERS as a supply.
Sure.
And we will treat VERS similar to any other resource, with the only difference that will cap their energy bid to their forecast. So they're going to be on the other side. But this net demand forecast gives you the idea.
I totally appreciate that. But for this thought experiment, let's assume that the only set of resources in this market participant's portfolio are hydro resources. And you had said earlier that the intent was to use the advisory operating schedule rather than a bid range to pass RSE. And kind of what I'm getting at here is I think you're going to need both. I think you're still going to need to measure whether or not the operating schedule can meet the net demand forecast, but I think you're also going to need the bids on every hour to make sure that they have capacity to meet the uncertain requirements and the reserve and the contingency reserve requirements on every hour. So I think you're going to need both pieces and not just one.
That's correct. The real sticky question is imbalance reserve and energy. They're fungible products, and they're used in combination to meet your combined target.
Yep.
And in the daily energy limit that we envision being as a constraint in the day-ahead market, it's the sum of your energy schedule plus your upward imbalance reserve award that is constrained under the energy limit.
Right.
So then, extrapolating this here, if this is not the net demand forecast that's shown in the backdrop, but let's say it's the demand forecast, so you don't have that value of the DAC there, since we're only saying the hydro and not theirs, then if this bars for the hydro is the operating plan that says this is how much energy plus imbalance reserve capacity I allocate to this resource for this hour, then we're talking on the same level. You have the requirement being demand forecast plus upward uncertainty, and the schedule, the operating schedule, says about how much is going to be the schedule for the sum of those two. So then we're aligned. Then once you have those.
But the result of that is that you're going to require this market participant to have sufficient energy over the day to meet that upward imbalance requirement on every hour of the day. And that seems a bit excessive.
Combination.
Yeah, well, and Steve, maybe, go ahead, George.
Yeah, well, the real target here is, in the capacity sense, is to meet both the demand forecast plus the demand forecast plus the uncertainty requirements, right? So you must have capacity in the market in the form of bids, energy plus imbalance reserve bids, to cover that combined target.
That's right? But if you just add that reserve requirement to the demand, you're imposing an energy requirement also that I think might be excessive. But
maybe you missed something that I said. Okay, I'll state it again. So if this bar here, if what we call here the hydro operating schedule is not energy, but energy plus upward uncertainty capacity, okay, then you can compare this bar with a bar behind it, which will be net demand forecast plus upward uncertainty, and now both bars speak to the same quantity.
I see. So you're talking about applying to both bars.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a detail. We can work this out, but it's a good comment, Steve, that if you have participants that are predominantly hydro, this capacity test is talking only about demand forecast, and this is the projected energy schedule, but it makes sense to have the schedule be projected energy plus projected capacity earmarked for imbalance reserves. Then we can use it in that sense.
All right, thanks, George. You give me something else to think about.
Yeah, me too.
Feel free to reach out, and to the extent you would like to put something forward for stakeholders to think about, by all means, let's work that out and get you on the agenda. All right, I'm going to move on. I've seen Doug sitting in the queue for quite a while, so let me go to Doug first. And Doug, if you wouldn't mind chiming in on Kathleen's previous concern regarding the ability to provide that advisory schedule first, and then maybe move on to if you had a separate question.
Actually, that's what I was responding to. So Doug Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I share Kathleen and Alva's concern. I mean, it just strikes me that if what the operator has available to it are the bids, and not, I mean, the advisory schedule, while it might be, feasible in isolation for the individual entity, the operator in aggregate has to only has available to it the bids. So it seems like, why wouldn't you just use the bids to make the determination? And essentially you're running sort of a pre-run of the market, to utilize those bids and see if you can.
Sure, if we run the market twice, we can do it. That's not a problem. But what we're trying to avoid is really running the market before running the market, and having the RSC as a screen, so that we can potentially even have it available on demand. We turn it into an optimization problem, market-like, with constraints, and using the bids to essentially have an objective function of maximizing the outcome of meeting the resource sufficiency evaluation target for each BAA. Then that will be your ultimate resource sufficiency evaluation test that says, give us the bids and your constraints, including your energy limits, and we'll find out if you're self-sufficient under the best possible scenario that the optimization of this particular effort will determine. But that's a
Yeah,
big problem to solve, right?
right, but you're going the opposite direction, right? You're saying, oh, I'm going to simplify the problem, and
Yeah.
I'm going to ignore some of the constraints and do other things, but then still do this test. And I guess what I'm wondering, it just seems to me, if parties make their guess as to what, what's the best way to use their resource, which, a lot of these resources have a lot of flexibility about when they can be used. And if people guess wrong, and then you tell them, oh, okay, in aggregate, it's not enough for me. I need you to make another guess. And so then people change their guesses, and the way you might have met it if people change their guess one way versus another way, and then you still have a problem, which to me seems like it's like a reduced or a simplified optimization problem anyway, is what you're doing. So, why
Are
couldn't you
you
do that?
suggesting that we use the bids and have the resource efficiency evaluation being some sort of an optimization? Handle these constraints, this energy? Because you're not suggesting just using the bids and ignoring the constraint, right? That would not be accurate. That's what led us to this discussion. The realization that a hydro resource has all the water behind the dam, and they can submit bids in the market that say you can use all that water. However, there is a real constraint in the market that says you cannot discharge more than X volume of water. It's essentially the bid, if it's used for the resource efficiency evaluation, it's not going to result in an accurate outcome.
Right. No,
So
I'm
this
saying
is what we're trying to address.
you'd respect whatever the important constraints are that you think you need to respect, like the available water over the day in this case, and the ramping capability of that resource. But
We can think like that. All right. I'm open to discussion, and this is the process in the working group here to examine ideas. And there are we have to find the silver lining here. If we are going to perform some sort of an optimization, come up with the RSC, considering energy limitations and constraints like that, then the RSC is not going to be available as an on-demand function, and we'll have to perform it at 9 because it will take some time to run now, and publish the results at 9 after 9 before we close the market at 10. We can even do it again at 10, but now it's eating into the timeline that we have for the market. So maybe this will require actually to close the market at 9, not receiving any more bids and information, so that we can run this test in an optimization fashion between 9 and 10, and then continue with the market, which doesn't leave you any room for error, putting all your eggs in one basket, saying, here are all the bids, use our bids and maximize our response to meet the target for resource efficiency evaluation. It's a little different than what we're thinking so far. If we are going to put this on the table for consideration, I'm not saying no, but we have to give some other things that we were thinking at the same time. We can't do all of it. We cannot have the optimization and have it on demand. There's no way, right?
Right. And maybe that's a, Doug, I hear your point, and maybe that's a question for the audience is, does it make sense to have this advisory operating schedule, a more simplistic screening from an RSC standpoint, with the ability for EDAM entities to have this on demand, or does it make more sense as a group to move towards this a little bit more complicated RSC that is, I think as a result, will be a little more accurate, considering all the constraints and things like that being consumed, but realizing that you're giving up the on-demand capability and potentially moving that timeline sooner so that the optimization has time to run. I've seen Jeff Spires with his hands up.
I'm sorry, Mark, just before can I give you my response before I sign off? And then
Sure.
I just wanted
Go ahead, Doug.
I have one observation about Steve Kern's example about not knowing the hydro operations yet. I guess I'm open to both ways. So I understand there's pros and cons of both. So I think it's worth exploring both paths.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the uncertainty about the hydro at that time of the day, whenever this test is run or when the market's run, it seems to me like, I mean, that's just the world we're in. And, we're going to necessarily have to only offer up what you have confidence in being able to provide at a particular point in time. And the other aspect of it becomes some element that you have to, recognize as uncertainty, and you'll be able to resolve that as you get into real time. Right. So it's like you'll have a confidence band for making those bids or making that advisory showing.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Doug. And Steve, if you wanted to, again, kind of going back to my previous comment, if you wanted to maybe take this back and from a hydro standpoint and potentially have a proposal, let me know and I'd be happy to fit you in. So Jeff Spires, I'm going to go to you next. I appreciate everyone's patience with their hands up. There's quite a bit of hands up, so I'm going to try to get through all of you.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, George. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. I appreciate you bringing this concept forward for more discussion. I think it's quite similar to what we were talking about before and what the EIM entities had suggested in the past around using kind of theoretical non-binding schedules for part of this test. And I just wanted to give a bit of feedback that's somewhat in response to, I think, the concerns that Alva and Kathleen have raised, which I think are reasonable concerns about kind of who's doing this, and also does it make sense for an individual scheduling coordinator to be providing this information. And maybe the first thing I would say is just in terms of whether this is necessary or not, I think really depends on what we're testing for. In the most simplistic, if we were just testing for maximum capacity in a given hour, then maybe just looking at the total bid range of the resources would suffice to do that. But I think at least up to this point, the assumption has been we're trying to test across the 24-hour period somehow in a way that's capturing some of the other elements of resource efficiency, namely energy constraints, and how do you show a resource that's only got some limited quantity of energy, which you've just been talking about. But the other one is flexibility, because I think what this also helps to do is incorporate some assessment of the ability to move your resources across multiple hours and assess that multi-hour flexibility capability. Because if you imagine you're trying to measure your portfolio's ability to reach your net load peak in hour 20, it kind of leads to the question of, it depends where I'm starting from in the previous hour or the previous couple of hours. If I don't know where my resources otherwise would have been, how do I measure whether I can ramp them up effectively to that peak hour? So by putting in this kind of schedule, it gives you a sense for whether, when you combine all your resources together over that 24-hour period, can you achieve that or not? But I do think it's a valid question to ask, how would this be done? Because I think a lot of the background on the way at least the EIM entities have been thinking about this probably stemmed from the EIM, where the EIM entity, as the BA, is looking at their whole portfolio entering in each hour, and the resource sufficiency test is structured at that BA level so that you have base schedules that need to match your demand forecast or be within a certain tolerance of your demand forecast, and then you need bid range above and beyond that to meet the upper end of the uncertainty band. And so this concept kind of extends that to the 24-hour period to say you're in effect showing how your portfolio is generally balanced against the load forecast across the 24 hours and then you have your bid range to move up or down to capture that uncertainty piece. So I do think it sort of makes sense, or would make sense, that the entity that's doing that has enough of the visibility of the resources for the BA that are contributing to the test, so that it's being put together in a way where the whole portfolio is contributing towards meeting that demand forecast. I'm not sure if it would be as effective if you had individual resources putting in a plan that isn't taking into consideration the other resources within that BA. So I think that is a question maybe worth considering under this type of approach.
Yeah, no, I think I'm tracking with you, Jeff. Are you saying it may make more sense for the EDAM entity, the BA, to be the one to provide this advisory operating schedule resource plan for their entire fleet on how they plan on meeting that load over the full 24-hour period? Okay.
Yes, I think that was somewhat of the context, just given the way that the RS test is structured in the EIM and the way that, at least outside of the Cal ISO, you might find a BA operator setting up their system in light of their own resource fleet plus whatever schedules they might be getting from third parties, and they have all that information and can put that together in a way that they can convey how they would meet the load in the BA. So right. You know, I know there'd be more complexity in the CAISO BA around the structure and the roles and responsibilities, but I think that was at least some of the line of thinking of adopting this type of approach.
Okay, and that, I believe I heard you say that was on behalf of the EIM entities. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think that would also remove some of the concerns we've heard voiced with the SC having the quote-unquote burden to provide this operating schedule. George, I didn't mean to step on you talking there. I want to give you an opportunity to provide a reaction, and then I'll move to Michelle Keto.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Jeff, for the suggestion. And yes, it's not new. It circles around the concepts that I think you presented too, about similar to a base schedule that we have in EIM. I would agree with you that for a utility or a load-serving entity that is the primary part of a BAA, it makes sense. You have some centralized planning of basically most of the resources in the BAA. But for third-party generation and elements that the EDAM or EIM entity is not in control, I don't think that will play out very well. We already know in EIM that some EIM entities, they have told us that they don't know what is the third-party generation doing, and we rely on bids and schedules submitted by these particular scheduling coordinators. And speaking for the SOBAA, you know, the market operator is not in control of how the investor-owned utilities will participate in the market. That's up to them, and they have their own plans, but the notion is that you submit bids and you expect the market, the day-ahead market, to calculate schedules optimally to tell you what's your daily plan for tomorrow is going to be to a certain extent. When it comes to hydro resources, of course, there's some planning going on. But in general, resources that are not energy limited, they don't really have a plan of operation. Their plan is to submit bids and procure the gas for those bids and be ready to respond to any optimal schedule that can come out from the market. So I think we're probably facing two extremes here. We'll probably have to find some middle solution. And we definitely need to hear more ideas on this subject. So let's open it up and see what other stakeholders think about this.
Thank you, George. Let's go to Michelle next. I appreciate your patience, Michelle. And then just a reminder, if you do not have a comment, please lower your hand. Jeff, I still see you. I don't know if you had an additional comment you wanted to add, but thank you. All right,
Sure.
go ahead.
This ties back to some of my other questions. So let's say that CAISO fails at the RSE test in the morning. So that information goes out and it's 1,000 megawatts for some reason. There is no coordinated action. So let's say the 44 LSEs in California's BAA, as well as those would be CPUC jurisdictionals, in addition to the 20 or 30, say, oh my gosh, we have a failure in the RSE. They collectively move their hydro to 8 a.m. only to make us fail at 7 p.m. So there's no coordination among those. Is there any way we could just, if you were following the slice of day, there was this idea of capacity and energy. Could you guys just take the energy and make a profile that helps us out in these circumstances? Just that's what I'm wondering. I mean, likewise, there might be 8 scheduling coordinators for hydro, and there might be 100 scheduling coordinators for batteries. We have sufficient resources for the batteries to meet the RSE. Let's say they can, pull from a certain hour if the market optimizes them. But if everyone is guessing at some particular schedule, they obviously are going to guess wrong because they don't collectively know what they're trying to hit.
Right. This is the problem with the resource efficiency evaluation being performed at the BAA level when you have different parties in that BAA submitting independent bids. Do I hear then that this notion of centralized planning, I can't believe I'm saying these words here, is gaining some traction just for the specific element of performing the resource efficiency evaluation, because that will certainly change our course that we were plotting in this work group so far, being a simple screen and all, right? If I hear a lot more.
I like the simple screen, but if the simple screen results in failures and the failure consequences are severe, then it doesn't work, right?
Okay, well, let's get some more comments from others and see where we're going with this. Mark, do we have other people on queue?
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I was talking to myself on mute. Thank you, George. Let's go to Stuart Kelly and then Paul Wood. Go ahead, Stuart.
Yeah, I think just building on Michelle's point and other issues raised with Kathleen and Alba, I think, George, the simple screen obviously works if you pass the test. And I don't think it's particularly difficult to create a simple screen. I don't know if there is an effective way to avoid some form of optimization that considers the constraints in the event you fail and have to rely on what a third party SC is bid. I mean, it's almost like what Jeff's proposing. If the entity itself come with some form of base schedule and then laid on top of that is what the profile would look like for third parties to see if you pass. So because this notion of coordination amongst parties in the event you fail, I don't know what that even looks like. That's not something the BA is going to do. It's kind of going to be looking back to the market, and the only way to understand where you can place the third parties is leverage the bid. So simple screen works in the event you pass. I think you can still have a simple screen, but unfortunately, I don't know if you can get away from optimization in some form, some limited form, to try and see if you pass the test with a third party input.
Thank you, sir.
Mark, are you trying to speak again?
I am. Sorry. Danny, did you want to pose a question or respond to Stuart on that?
Yeah, something Stuart said just gave me a thought, and it's that I think the idea of coordination within each BAA would have to happen regardless of which design path we take, whether it's the simple screen or the optimization. I think the idea is with the simple screen, some of that coordination would have happened on the front end going into the RSE, and then maybe there'd be a plan on how that could get addressed within the EDAM BAA. On the other side of a more complex optimization that all the different scheduling coordinators within BAAs are offering bids, to the extent that the RSE would fail, there would still need to be coordination within that BAA to cure that failure prior to the final binding RSE. So I think this is a problem that, independent of which path we end up taking, will have to be addressed within each BAA.
Thank you, Danny. I see Paul Wood, and Paul, I believe you're with Pacific Corp, so I would like to hear, from an EIM entity standpoint, what your thoughts are on this, and maybe if I can encourage other EIM entities to chime in as well, I'd appreciate it. Let's go to Paul Wood.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Paul Wood with Pacific Corp. Yeah, I'm trying to process what you guys are proposing or thinking about, and when I think about an energy limited resource, from our perspective, it not only is it hydro, and then whether it's some hybrid resource as well, but it's also our gas assets. We view them as kind of an energy limited resource where you've only got so much fuel that you have to manage on a day-ahead basis. I'm trying to process what the advisory schedule is doing. I mean, I get how you're shaping your limited hydro capacity over the peak hours. You've got a megawatt hour volume you have to stay within. But I just don't get the advisory schedule piece.
Yeah, well, it's an indication about how you could potentially use this resource to meet your requirements without exceeding your energy quota, if you will. So
do I? Sorry.
Yeah. So we believe its scheduling coordinator is uniquely qualified to come up with that schedule, not the market operator. We don't know about your hydro limitations or what is involved. So that's why the proposal here is for the scheduling coordinator who has some relations with the plant operator. There must be some plan in place for hydro resources that, this plan could be communicated for the purpose of using it in the RSE. That's the underlying idea behind this.
So I shape my hydro and gas much like you've got in your example here?
Yes, again, for advisory purposes. It's not going to bind you on the schedules. The schedules are going to still be produced by the bids that you provide to the market. But if you have, some energy limitation, then the market is going to use that constraint to make sure that it doesn't produce an infeasible schedule. For gas resources, we don't have something similar, although you could use an energy limitation as well if you convert your potential gas volume to an energy limit. You can still use that feature, and then it becomes a similar problem here by actually providing an advisory plan about how this resource could operate without exhausting or going over its allotted gas quota, which we could use in the resource efficiency evaluation to calculate contributions for each hour for this resource against the RSC target, right? That's the main idea of this approach.
Okay, I'm just trying to.
So that's the decentralized approach, right? It's decentralized in the sense that each scheduling coordinator makes their own plan, advisory plan of operation. They share it with the market operator to perform the RSE. The other idea on the table that you have been hearing is that it's the centralized point of view that we don't know how to come up individually with a coordinated plan. Here's our resource limitations and bids. Why don't you, the market operator or some other independent entity, come up with a plan which is coordinated for the BAA? I think you have these two opposing alternatives, and they have pros and cons, obviously, that we need to carefully consider to come up with a reasonable trade-off here.
Okay. Okay, I appreciate that. That helps.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate your comments and question. Alva, I'm going to go to you next.
Thanks. I think there might be a third way between what you're describing as the centralized and the decentralized, George, which is more along the lines of what Jeff was talking about, which is that the resource sufficiency evaluation is basically a showing by each EDAM entity at, let's say, at 9 o'clock, meeting a requirement for sufficiency, which is put together by the EDAM entity, not by the market operator. The market operator might still need to do some form of test of those, but I think in general the design should be such that that showing is likely to be robust, except for the fact that loads change and resources go out on outage and things like that are not really appropriately dealt with in the resource sufficiency context. So just want to suggest that as a sort of a design theme of what this might be about. I think almost all of the comments are consistent with what I think would be good things to take into account in improving this design. I do think it's having I think in particular Doug brought up the difficulties with having an iterative approach, almost a bulletin board type of approach. You're not going to get optimality that way, and you're not going to have stability either necessarily, as Michelle pointed out. So I think some responsibility for this might best be placed with the EDAM entities in order to get these kinds of hydro issues addressed where it would be most appropriate. Thanks.
Thank you, Alva.
Thank you, Alva.
Just to make sure I characterize your suggestion appropriately, you're proposing sort of like a centralized approach where the EDAM entity receives the information about the resource bid range and resource capabilities and constraints, and they themselves come up with a feasible operating plan, knowing their RSC target that would basically meet their RSC target, and they submit this plan for the resources in the BA to the market operator to confirm or validate that the target is met.
That's correct.
The question that I have on this is whether we're raising the stakes for EDAM participation now if EDAM entities are to assume that responsibility and essentially develop procedures and maybe software to do this. This was not in the plan when we started, so we have to be careful. We don't want to, there is already a significant implementation involved for joining EDAM and designing the systems that will interface with the market operator and receive and exchange data and all this stuff. Now we're talking about something which is on top of that, essentially coming up with a process for doing this centralized planning for your resources in your BAA. And don't get me wrong, maybe some BAAs, they already have this process in place, particularly if a large chunk of the resources is a merchant utility. But other BAAs don't. You have multiple parties, and maybe they have to develop a new process. So I want to be a little bit careful and sensitive to the fact that we may be raising limitation, expectations, and requirements here.
And I think you could just consider the possibility that it's possible that CAISO, I mean, to go back to what Stuart was saying, the level of optimization that's required here is actually pretty simple. It goes back to my early days in the utility business when we were talking about merit order dispatch and peak shaving, and not attempting to be feasible to all transmission constraints, not attempting to optimally commit resources. So I think there are simpler versions of the scheduling problem that potentially CAISO could provide simple tools if the EDAM entity was unable to do it itself. It's just something to think about anyway.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Alva.
I'm telling you, it can get complicated really fast when we start talking about constraints. And when I go to the next slide where I'm going to discuss how the same picture looks for storage, with storage having state of charge constraints, it can get complicated very fast. But nothing is simple anymore like these old days that you mentioned, Alva.
Thank you, George. And let me see if I can get some of the EIM entities to weigh in here. Kind of going back to what Jeff stated earlier, where it'd be up to the EDAM entity to provide this quote unquote resource plan, operation plan, advisory resource operation plan heading into the day, if that's something that is feasible and in the direction of how you foresaw the RSE shaping. So if you're comfortable, Southwest, Northwest entities, please raise your hand. Or I can start calling on you. Maybe SRP, APS. Do I have anybody on the line willing to chime in? All right, I can always send an email offline. Oh, I see Christine with her hand up. Go ahead, Christine.
Hi, I'm not sure I have, an answer right away on that particular question, but it would be a change from what we're doing now. So I think that would be, as George mentioned, it would be a different process. So, and I do agree with a lot of the comments that others have made about kind of the trial and error aspect of this as well, regardless of who is submitting the schedules. I think regardless, it'll be, if we pass, that's very simple. If we fail, it's going to require trying to assess how we can reorganize a lot of resources that have a lot of different constraints to satisfy the test. So I'm thinking particularly for MSGs that might have fuel constraints in addition. I think that's going to be very complex problem to solve. And I'm also thinking through, and this might be a little bit in the weeds, but trying to make sure we're converting our intertemporal constraints that are sub-hourly into an hourly test as well would also be something that would make this a little bit more complex as well.
Thank you for your comments, Christy. And Christy's from SRP for the audience. Let me go to Stuart Kelly, who represents LA. And then I'll come to you, Kathleen. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think, Alva, conceptually what you propose I understand, but I think that's too. I personally think, from my experience and looking at the different grid operations, the entity effectively, I think it would be too much of a burden to place on the entity themselves, and hugely, I feel it's going to be hugely duplicative of existing systems and trying to separate from compliance purposes that information. But that said, I mean, some derivative of what you're proposing, maybe that's actually done by the market, may work. I just feel that the burden would be too much if placed on the entities, just at first blush, if I'm following what you're saying. So thank you.
No, thank you for your comments there, Stuart. Danny, did you want to respond to that? And then I'm going to go to Kathleen.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'm just thinking through that comment that you made, Stuart, and I think the perspective that we at least came at this from with this potential design option was that the potential EIM entities as BAAs are already doing some type of analysis to make sure that they're able to shape the resources and supply within their BAA to meet their BAA's obligations. So I just wanted to put that out there. I don't think we're opposed to the other design option. We need to think through, as George has pointed out, there's pros and cons on both sides, but that's at least why we're presenting what we're presenting right now.
Thank you, Danny. All right, let's go to Kathleen. Thank you for your patience, Kathleen.
Great. No, thank you. This is Kathleen Colfer from Vistra. No patience needed. Fabulous conversation today. Got a lot of really great feedback from everyone. Just, took lots and lots of notes, guys. So I'm going to be thinking about this more. I think this is a complex challenge. George, I noted something you said that really, really, really rang true for me. And it was that we may need to find a middle solution here. I know Alva kind of took a stab at that. I have some thoughts of my own that maybe solve some of these complexities. Not saying it's the best option, but it's an alternate option afloat that would be more of a middle ground. And so kind of with that in mind, if we were to take that back, work with some stakeholders, and try and bring something that might look like a middle ground forward, what would be a good time for that in this process?
Mark?
Yeah, so Kathleen, I would encourage you to definitely reach out to those parties you would like to get feedback from, and then let's coordinate on a time. Based on the current scope item schedule, I would say sooner the better, as it pertains to having a plan and what that actually looks like for RSE counting and resource qualification, because there are quite a bit of details we need to work out prior to, moving into some of these other items. But I'll take a look at those scope items and see if there's a topic that's kind of a standalone topic that doesn't necessarily depend on having an answer tomorrow prior to us continuing to make progress. So feel free to reach out to me offline and we'll coordinate on a time. Let me go to Jeff Spires next.
Thanks, Mark. Jeff Spires with PowerX again. I just wanted to kind of agree with the way Danny characterized the thinking on this, or at least the previous, couple years ago discussions with EIM entities, and similar to what the presentation back in February of 2020 was getting at, it was basically, I think, an assumption that the test would be relatively straightforward. And we characterized it at the time as basically a spreadsheet where you would have the 24 hours over the day, you'd have a load forecast and your supply portfolio that you would be able to basically fill out the 24 hours using these theoretical schedules just to show how they would be put together to balance the system for the day, and that would be your resource plan. So, I think if there are concerns that that's burdensome amongst the group of BAs or EIM entities that would be tasked with that, then there's probably other approaches. It just seemed as though that might be one viable alternative, provided that the overall structure of the test is relatively simple, because presumably most BA operators are already trying to perform some variation of planning in terms of how are they going to set up their system to meet their needs for the following day. So just a little bit extra background there. I don't think we're, like from PowerX's perspective, I think we're flexible on exactly what the approach is. There could be other ways to achieve it. It just seemed like it might be one simple way to kind of leverage what people might already be doing today. But if that's not appealing, then I think we could go a different direction too.
No, thank you, Jeff. And maybe we have a few days until our next working group meeting this coming Monday. So I think this has been great conversation. As Christina mentioned, we will try to get this recording published within 1-2 days as soon as we get it from the vendor. So maybe this is something that all stakeholders go back, continue to think on, and we continue these discussions next week. And we'll just pull up this slide, George, and allow everyone to start going through it again. I do want to recognize the time. It is 2:53, so I want to turn it over to Bob Cott to kind of summarize today's conversation, and then we'll strategize a plan for next week.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Well, just we started off the day with George presenting the RSC Excel spreadsheet, which I understand will be posted as an educational tool, so everybody can kind of get an idea what the thoughts were about how that would work. Then we moved into some examples of the presentation of the energy limited resource efficiency evaluation, and started getting into the examples of the energy profile for hydro. I don't know that we ever got to the slide for the energy storage. That is part of the presentation. We started then getting into the details of how the RSC would work, and whether the SEs would submit bids, and just the concerns about SEs submitting profiles was a concern, and then also there's a big burden potentially for the BAAs or the EDAM entities to perform the profile piece, and it sounds like we're going to maybe have the potential for entities to come through and propose some plan that might land somewhere in the middle of that. Summary, back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Bob. All right, before we conclude, are there any comments, questions, or clarifications that anyone would like to add? Or George, did you have anything based on some of the items you heard with those last few comments from stakeholders?
No, Mark, I think we need to take all this back and, open it up again for further discussion. At this point now, we have potentially different directions that we can move. And as you mentioned, because we don't have much time to deliberate, we have to come to a reasonable conclusion of what we want to do here so that we can progress. So we shouldn't spend more than what time is absolutely necessary to examine the alternatives and weigh in the pros and cons, but we have to move relatively fast on that and stick to an approach that, makes sense for all of us.
Absolutely, George. Thank you. And again, I encourage stakeholders to, Kathleen, you had made a comment, anyone that would be willing to present some options based on everything they heard today, please discuss that with your peers and feel free to reach out to me, and then we can definitely be prepared to discuss that and give you the opportunity to present your proposal this coming Monday so we can kind of land on what to do from a advisory plan, who's providing it, and then move forward. That's all we had today. I appreciate everyone's time. I recognize we did not get to the demand response conversation that we do also need to tackle next. So maybe we'll plan on doing that on Wednesday to the extent we're able to close this out on Monday. All right, have a great rest of your afternoon, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.